versus Nikon. This is a debate that's been going on for, well, really since the 40s. Like, it's been going on for a long time, and these two companies have just been neck and neck the whole time. I released a video like this more than a year ago, but it's definitely time for an update because a lot has changed. First, I want to address what I know is going to be the most common question. What about Sony, Pentax, Fuji, etc.? So go through them one by one. All these companies make awesome cameras. First, almost all of these camera companies have their own kind of particular niche. Whereas Canon and Nikon, they're almost, the camera systems are virtually identical. You really have to split hairs to decide that one of them is better than the other. Sony, for example, has a focus on video. They have 4K video. It's also a mirrorless system. So what we see is the autofocusing system at a given price point doesn't quite match those of the DSLRs. And it's a newer system, so they don't have the same lens selection. I also say, at the moment, Sony doesn't have any cameras with like dual card slots and things that professionals want. So maybe they don't have that headroom to grow into between the limited lens selection and the lack of dual card slots. Still, Sony's are cameras that we use constantly for different tasks. They're just not kind of the general purpose SUVs of the photography world like Canon and Nikon are. Pentax has just now released their very first full frame camera, but even so, the number of lenses available doesn't quite match that of Canon and Nikon. And Pentax is a very value-oriented company. They offer more features for less money. It's definitely worth looking at, but it's not, you wouldn't ever get confused about really whether to get a Pentax or a Canon or a Nikon. It's something else. And Fuji makes APS-C mirrorless cameras, and they have a very good selection of high quality lenses, but at the same time, again, it's not this sort of monstrous, confusing DSLR world. I don't think anybody's debating whether they should get a Canon or a Fuji. The systems are just completely different. Same with Panasonic. Panasonic focuses on video, and like the GH4 is an amazing video camera. The G7, those are cameras we're recommending all the time for those things. They also make workable stills cameras, not the big two though. Olympus has beautiful little cameras that we love for travel. They have things like sensor stabilization, just a fantastic feature. But again, it's an entirely different animal from these sort of big general purpose DSLRs with their long history and thousands and thousands of available lenses. Samsung, it seems like they've kind of given up the ghost. Since last time, the major changes that we've seen that are kind of changing the story, I have to tell. Before, the Nikon D810 was really pulling Canon users into the Nikon world because it had 36 megapixels and all us Canon guys had was 24 megapixels. So it was really tempting. But now Canon announced the 5DSR with 50 megapixels. So now Canon has leapfrogged up and taken over as kind of the high-res king. But whereas Canon used to be it for sports and wildlife with the 7D Mark II, with their amazing 10 frames per second and pretty low price point, Nikon completely took that over by releasing the D500, really exciting. Same thing, Canon used to really have, especially at the lower end, a much better selection of wildlife lenses to get people started in wildlife photography. But now we've tested that Nikon 200 to 500, and that is a game changer. Canon and Nikon released their new versions of their top-end cameras, the Canon 1DxMark II and the Nikon D5, and then really didn't change anything. They're still like virtually identical cameras with very few distinguishing features. In the past, I had to criticize Nikon for not having any radio-controlled flashes, but they have radio-controlled flashes now, so there are actually lots of native and third-party options available. So that difference has just kind of disappeared, and I won't even mention it further because it doesn't really matter. Nikon still has some key advantages. Their cameras still tend to have better dynamic range and lower noise. And people are going to debate this, but I actually much prefer the controls on the Nikon cameras. And some models specifically are making leaps forward, like the Nikon D500 has a tilting touchscreen. And it has lighted buttons at the back. So little nice touches, but really the controls work just fine for either camera, and you get used to one and might learn to hate the other. Canon, though, with the 5DSR tends to have better detail. Canon also has more lower cost options, especially for lenses. They tend to have cheaper lenses available. They might be truly cheaper and that they're lower quality too. But most photographers, the idea of spending $500 or $600 on a camera and lens is too much. So at the low end there, the most frequent type of camera that we recommend to people, Canon really has better options available to you. You can get more done on a lower budget with Canon. Misspelled lens on this slide, but often when we compare a Canon lens to a Nikon lens, the Canon lens tends to outperform the Nikon lens in one way or another. So it's not clear. It's not like Canon is better than Nikon or vice versa, but they each have their own strengths. Let's go through and look at some key segments in the camera market, starting with the entry-level camera. These are the first cameras that somebody's going to buy if they're interested in photography and maybe they don't have thousands of dollars to spend on gear. For Canon right now, that's the Canon T6. Both these cameras, no articulating screen, no touch screen, entry-level cameras, but both very capable of making great images. Looking at the current prices, the T6 is actually about 10% cheaper than the Nikon D3300. With their kit lens, so the D3300 brags about having 24 megapixels, but with the kit lens, they both have about the same image because they're both limited by the fairly low quality of the included kit lens. If you put a higher quality lens on there, like the Sigma 18-35, which is an extremely sharp, like pro grade lens, then you'll see more detail out of the D3300. So in other words, you probably wouldn't buy the Sigma 18-35 because it's an expensive lens if you really are on that tight budget. But at the same time, the T6 has a couple of features that the D3300 lacks, like it has bracketing and it has Wi-Fi capabilities, and those are important, especially for the modern entry-level photographer. And I don't know why the D3300 doesn't have that, and let me just point out that this is a moment in time. So Photokina is coming up soon, and I'm sure we're going to see one company leapfrogging the other. If you are invested in one system, often the best thing to do is just to sit back and wait. It just depends how long you're willing to wait. Canon users waited many years after the release of the Nikon D800 to get a high megapixel body with the 5 DSR, but it did eventually come. Whether it's worth it to you to sell the equipment that you have and invest in another system, it's up to you. Speaking of kind of saving money, at the low end, Canon has lenses that are just cheaper. And you get your kit lens, but the first lens I recommend people buying after their kit lens is almost always the 50mm f1.8, because the nifty 50, because people want to take those kind of headshots or portraits with nice background blur. But again, people don't have thousands of dollars to spend, and people don't necessarily care about sharpness or build quality. Most people. The Canon price point at this for the STM version of the lens is $125. Though you can get older versions of the lens for around $100 or even cheaper, like newer refurbished lenses. The Nikon lens, you need to get the 50mm f1.8G model if you want to autofocus on those entry-level bodies. There is a less expensive 50mm f1.8D, which is also a great lens, but you need to get a higher-end body like a D7200 if you're going to focus with it. So that kind of eliminates it from being a budget lens because you can't put it on those budget bodies. Nonetheless, the 50 f1.8G from Nikon is a better quality lens than the Canon. But at this price point, the people who are really looking at a budget, this can be the difference between buying the lens or not buying the lens. So if you have $125, you're going to get the Canon, but you're not going to be able to get the Nikon. And that's such an important factor to so many people who aren't maybe watching this with big budgets, that it does cause me to steer people at the entry level into the Canon world. And once they enter the Canon world, they tend to stay in the Canon world because you buy a lens and then you buy another lens and then you want a body that you don't want to have to throw away all your lenses. Another example of a way to save a few bucks by being in the Canon world at the entry-level point are these are terrible lenses. These are the Yongnuo 50mm f1.8 lenses, and we tested them, and they're appalling by any objective measure, but they're cheap. And for some reason, the Canon version is about $30 cheaper at current prices than the Nikon version. And again, that $30 can matter to people who don't necessarily care about quality, but want to get in as cheap as possible. And I do see this as a general trend. When you look at third-party lenses, third-party flashes, things tend to come out first for Canon because Canon is number one and Nikon is number two. So if you are a third party, you would want to get it out first for the bigger audience. Canon also tends to have a wider variety of used equipment available because the market is slightly bigger. And I don't know if it's an economy of scale thing, but Canon lenses can often end up being a little bit cheaper than the Nikon version. Let's move up from the entry level and look at kind of the ideal sports and wildlife bodies. So these are the top end APS-C cameras, which we find to be ideal for shooting like long distance action. Both the Canon 7D Mark II and the Nikon D500 have 10 frames a second, and they both have amazing autofocus systems, though the D500 has a slight edge there in our testing. The 7D Mark II is cheaper at $1,600 versus the Nikon's $2,000. It's also old at this point. Like, we're eagerly awaiting a 7D Mark III, but we haven't seen it yet. So at this point in time, we really much prefer the Nikon D500. It has no AA filter. And the AA filter, the anti-aliasing filter, is this layer on top of the camera's sensor, which is designed to reduce moire, little weird patterns that you might see when photographing fabric. But it reduces the sharpness of the entire image. And when we did our D500 review, I compared shots taken with the two cameras, even with the same lens, and the images were much sharper out of the Nikon D500. Removing that anti-aliasing filter gave you a big jump in sharpness, and I never had any moire problems with the sort of sports and wildlife that you tend to shoot this with these bodies. So this completely changed our recommendation. Up until our testing of the D500, we'd been recommending the 7D Mark II as kind of the ideal sports and wildlife camera. But now we're just recommending the D500. So this shifted so much. So I know people watching us had bought so much Canon camera gear before this, and kudos to Nikon for stepping up, improving the entire photography world and the results that we're getting, and really being competitive, answering Canon's very excellent 7D Mark II. They also threw in things that are practical and useful in the real world, like Wi-Fi, so that when you're out taking wildlife pictures and maybe you have a few minutes before the next bird shows up, you could throw a picture on Instagram and get some social networking done. The tilt screen, which just makes it so practical in everyday use, and a touch screen, which makes it very easy to quickly review your pictures and flip through them. Great job, Nikon. You changed the game with the D500. On the other hand, Canon really changed the game with the 5DSR. I don't hear a lot about the 5DSR, maybe because it's at a high price point, but we absolutely love ours. And we frequently, Chelsea still kind of grabs the D810, but there have been a lot of times when she ended up switching from the D810 to the 5DSR, maybe because the battery ran out or she just wanted to switch cameras for safety purposes. The 5DSR images are not only more detailed, but they also tend to just overall process better. And both cameras are fantastic to use, but the images out of the Canon now surpass those from the D810 in our opinion, and we're kind of waiting on Nikon's answer. Maybe it'll come, but again, at this point in time, the 50 megapixel 5DSR makes a difference. And I went to DxO and looked at their objective measurements of a variety of different lenses. And what we see is with the native 24-70s, the 5DSR is putting out 32 perceptual megapixels of detail compared to the D810's 21 perceptual megapixels of detail. And we see that when we actually take pictures. Especially with the sharper the lens, the more of a difference you see. And these are sharp lenses, and you get really sharp pictures out of the Canon. With the Tamron 24-70, the same lens, it's not quite as sharp. So you get 24 out of the Canon and 23 out of the Nikon. Not that much of a difference there. But with the sharper Tamron 70-200, we see 36 perceptual megapixels from the Canon and 28 out of the Nikon. Either one might be enough. It's not like you D810 users are complaining about not having enough detail. They're both a ton of detail. But those 36 megapixels make a difference, especially in things like studio portraits. We can make bigger and better looking prints. For wildlife photographers, especially those maybe shooting still subjects who don't need to track action or shoot at a high frame rate, the 600 f4 from each company, the 5DSR produces an amazing 37 perceived megapixels from their 600 f4, whereas the D810 produces only 24. It's still a respectable 24. That's a lot of detail. But 37, you can see you're getting over 50% more detail. And that's huge, especially if you're a wildlife photographer. If you can imagine that you might have to close that much more distance in order to get the same detail, can often be impossible. If you're looking at that level of camera, you also need to look at the very important 70-200 f2.8. This is our most used lens, no doubt, especially for shooting portraits and weddings. It's a versatile zoom, and well, sometimes in photography you pick a body that you like, and then you find the best lens you can put on it. But other times you find the right lens, and then you pick the best body that you put on it. And when we're shooting portraits, we have the Canon and Nikon versions of this. We start with the lens. We say, there's only one lens I want to use for this portrait session. It's a Canon 70-200 f2.8, and then we put the best Canon body on it, because there really is no replacement for the Canon 70-200 f2.8 because of focus breathing. The Canon 70-200 f2.8 at close range, we've measured it at being about 70 millimeters to 195 millimeters. And on a 5DSR, it produces about 33 perceptual megapixels of detail. When you look at the Nikon, and this is at headshot range, close-up range, the Nikon zoom actually performs at about 60 to 130 millimeters and produces less detail in the D810, about 27 perceived megapixels. So the Canon now, this was a little bit of a different story. The Canon used to be less sharp because we were shooting on a 24 megapixel 5D Mark III. But with the 5DSR, we can now get more detail and greater range, kind of the best of both worlds. And it makes a significant difference in our final images in the real world. Now, I've kind of talked about Nikon's focus breathing issue with the 70-200 before. When you're shooting at close range, it's not a true 200 millimeters. That's because the lens elements need to shift around inside, and when you focus closer, the back element or some rear element needs to move further away from the sensor, and as it moves further away, it's actually stealing space from the focal length of the lens. So if this is the end of the lens, you can see it's kind of moving in and out here. So as you get closer and closer, this back element moves in, shrinking the actual focal length. That's called focus breathing. And it means that with the Nikon, you need to take a couple of steps forward when you're shooting headshots. At distances for things like sports, it really doesn't matter. Even for full body shots, it's kind of a wash. But if you shoot headshots for things like weddings, it can be really important. And some people will say, I don't take that many shots at 200 millimeters and fine. But I do. I went through my actual shots, and I found that about more than a third of my shots were taken at the long end of the 70-200, at 200 millimeters. And 60% were taken close to the long end, between 150 and 200 millimeters, especially at close range. This is all you can't get here with the Nikon at close range, because again, the Nikon caps out at around 130 millimeters up close. This is the type of shot that you get at 200 millimeters and f2.8. So a headshot, very flattering features, and a completely blown out background. Some people have pointed out that the previous generation Nikon 70-200 f2.8 does not have that focus breathing problem, and that is true. It's been measured at 70 to 190 millimeters. However, it has significantly less detail than the more modern version does, at only 20 megapixels, perceived megapixels. So it's less sharp, but it doesn't have that kind of focus breathing design defect. And because I know people will ask, we've tested the Tamron Sigma and even the Pentax 70-200s, they all have the same focus breathing problem. Literally the only 70-200, current generation 70-200 we've tested that doesn't have it is the Canon. So I'm hoping Nikon or Tamron or Sigma or somebody will step up and fix the problem. I'll also add, in our pursuit to find a good 200 millimeter zoom for things like weddings on the Nikon system, we even tried out the huge Sigma 120 to 300 millimeter zoom, which is really too heavy to handhold for a given portrait or wedding session. But its focus breathing was so severe that even though it was listed as a 300 millimeter lens, at headshot range, it was shorter than the Canon 200 millimeters. So it shrunk below 200 millimeters to maybe like 185 or 190 millimeters. So even that couldn't get us closer for headshots than the little Canon, and it was way more expensive and much heavier. This is the difference between a proper 200mm f2.8 with no focus breathing and a lens with focus breathing. And you might look at these two pictures and not see any difference. Fine. In that case, you'll be happy with the Tamron, the Sigma, the Nikon, whatever. But I do see a difference. As you can see, the background blur is much more on the picture on the left. You can kind of see the shape of a shed that's back here. And it's much more spaced out on the Canon image on the left. The facial features of the picture on the left are also a little more flattering because it's more compressed. You know, this being at much less than 200mm, your facial features will be a little more exaggerated. The nose will seem bigger, the forehead will seem bigger, and generally for portraits, especially when you can't carefully pose them or you can't necessarily choose your model, things like weddings and events, that makes a tangible difference. Some information about DxO. We're going to look at some numbers from DxOMark about these lenses. If you want more information about how to use DxO, watch my video at stp.io/DxO. This shows you the sharpness of the Canon 7200 versus the Nikon 7200. And you can see they're both very sharp lenses. But once you get to the long end at 200mm in the lower right corner here, we see this spot of orange and red. And that's because the Nikon at 200mm, not only does it have focus breathing problems, but it becomes significantly less sharp at this long end. This is DxOMark's chart for the sharpness of each of the lenses at the long end. And green is good and orange is bad. So you can see the Nikon 7200, such an important lens in a camera lineup, it simply does not match the Canons. And this, I know it's just one lens, but for portrait photographers and a lot of wedding and event photographers, it is the lens. And for a lot of sports photographers too, it is the lens. So if you follow the philosophy of first picking a lens and then finding a good body for it, the Canon 7200 is such an important lens that it will make me recommend Canon to a lot of photographers who might otherwise go to Nikon. So Nikon does have a few alternatives. Like they have a 200mm f2, which is kind of a problem because it's like $6,000 and it weighs like 6.5 pounds or something like that. It's very heavy, which means for things like weddings and portraits, you're not going to be able to really handhold it. And because it's a prime, it doesn't have the versatility that you might need. Nikon also has, Canon has a 200mm f2.8, something that Nikon lacks. And like I said, Nikon's f2 200mm, kind of too big. So I'm going to go over some suggestions for different types of photographers in which camera lineup, at the moment, they're best buying into. If you're a casual photographer, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you're a casual photographer, isn't going to be collecting any specialty lenses. They're not going to be sweating the differences of a little amount of sharpness or a little amount of dynamic range or whatever. So really just find a camera that feels good in your hands and that you can afford. If you're on a budget, Canon really seems to provide a better deal than any other manufacturer when you factor in both the body and a couple of lenses. So you could find cheaper cameras than the entry-level Canon T6, but by the time you add in a couple of lenses, especially if you're looking at like the Fuji or the Sony world, the lenses in those worlds tend to be more expensive, especially when you factor in like used prices. For landscape photography, I know this comes out of nowhere, but I'm now encouraging people to check out the Pentax K1, which we just had an amazing experience with. You can get two lenses basically for landscape shooting with this. The 15-30, which is made by Tamron, and the 24-70, which is also made by Tamron. And they're both great. They're both very sharp. And the Pentax beats both Canon and Nikon in a few ways. It has a tilting screen, which when you're working on a tripod, really useful. It has pixel shift, which provides like basically perfect color information for every single pixel, kind of counteracting the limitations of the Bayer filter on there. Great camera. It also has Wi-Fi, which makes it much easier to share your pictures. I am assuming Canon and Nikon will kind of answer these limitations in their next generation, maybe even this September at Photokina. But for now, really, check out our review of the Pentax K1 if you're a landscape photographer. Short of that, I would generally choose the Canon 5 DSR because for landscapes, that extra detail of having that 50 megapixel sensor and kind of the overall, like narrowly better Canon glass. It's tough to say. You'd have to compare specific lenses. But overall, I like the Canon glass, and the 50 megapixels makes a big difference. And that's important for landscape photographers who have that budget. For action photographers, I would push you into the Nikon world for now. Even if you're not getting the D500 now, if you don't have the budget for that, it's nice to be in that world. We don't know what the future holds. You're going to be okay if you're in the Canon world. But if you're buying into it, the D500 is a game changer. And as I said before, for people who want to make large prints or who are just generally obsessed with detail, maybe you're cropping heavily, Canon, the 5DSR specifically, is the best camera. And if that's not in your budget right now, you could buy in cheaper and know that later you could maybe upgrade to a used model. Even in a couple of years, the 5DSR is still going to be a high-resolution, good quality camera. And again, the D500 has changed this recommendation. I used to recommend Canon for wildlife. Now I'm pushing people towards Nikon, not just because of the D500 body, but because of the availability of the 150 or the Nikon 200 to 500 millimeter lens. This lens, it beat on the D500, it beat our Canon 100 to 400 Mark II. It beat the Tamron 150 to 600. It beat the Sigma 150 to 600s. It beat everything except our big 500 millimeter f4 Canon Prime, which costs like 4 times more. The D500 and the 200 to 500 Nikon is the best value for wildlife photography right now. It just blows everything else out of the water. So I have to push people towards this. And if you don't have the budget for all this right now, starting starting cheaper in the world, and then if you want to upgrade later, at least you'll know that you'll have that option. For portraits, again, the only distinguishing factor I can really make is that the Canon 70-200 is amazing, and the higher megapixel 5DSR. You don't always need the megapixels for the portraits, but we do sometimes. Sometimes you end up making really large prints for people, and it really can make a difference. So you could take great portraits with Nikon, and you can take great wildlife photos with Canon, because like I said, the differences require you to split hairs. Any camera system can make good pictures in any type. It's narrow. But if you are into portrait photography, for the time being, Canon has a slight edge. If you're into video, both companies are really lagging behind the competition. Sony and Panasonic are both better video cameras, partly for having mirrorless platforms where you can use the electronic viewfinder, but they also support 4K. Panasonic generally makes better video cameras than Sony does, not necessarily for image quality, but for usability, because they have fully articulating screens that can flip out and turn around. They have touch screens that allow you to touch the focus. And this has been a problem for us lately. The GH4s do not overheat, but the Sony cameras do. Our A7R II and our A6300 have been overheating, especially now as we're moving into summer and temperatures are getting just a little bit warmer. We're in Connecticut, so it's not like it's super hot. It's like 75, 80 degrees tops. These things are overheating regularly and screwing up our shoots. So we're actually reverting back to the GH4, which is still an awesome camera and therefore still my video recommendation. I hope this has helped. Give me a like if you found any of this helpful. If you have questions or follow-up comments, just write a polite comment down below. Also, check the description of the video for any corrections that I might have made. If I did make a mistake, check through the comments. Chances are good somebody else has commented on it. You don't have to write your own comment. Just give that one a like, and I promise I'll respond to any mistakes, oversights, or omissions. Thanks so much. Bye.